Okay, let's get started, everyone, if that's all right. So welcome back to week 2 of branding and marketing communications. It's nice to see so many of you here. There should be some copies of the slides at the back and at the front if you haven't got a copy. Do you need a copy? Are there any slides at the back? Yeah, there's a car there. Right at the back. Sorry. Okay, so just to remind you all, I'm Robert Cluley. I'm the module leader and main lecturer for this course. You've got my contact details on the slide. Please do feel free to get in touch if you've got any more questions or comments or concerns about the course. I know this week a couple of people have been to see me to ask about readings. There is a course textbook for this course, which we talked about last week. I've heard reports that all the copies are out of the library now. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do about that. The best thing to do is to go and speak to the library and see if they'll order some more copies. I've been arguing for a while that they should get an electronic copy, but they haven't bothered. So, yeah, speak to the library about that. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do at this stage. But yeah, if you've got any more questions or thoughts or anything, please do feel free to get in touch. As ever, just to remind you, email is definitely the best way to get in touch with me. I think there's some people who have signed on to the course over the last week, so you might not have heard all the details about the course. So if you have got any questions about what's happening on the module, please feel free to come speak to me. So today we're going to start the first serious engagement with... Oh, sorry. Yeah, we're going to have our first serious engagement with branding, marketing communications theory, and we're starting off looking at psychological theories of advertising. Last week we looked at rhetoric and tried to consider whether branding and marketing communication should be understood as a simple form of communication where you transmit an idea, like a monologue as we call it, you transmit an idea from one person to another, or if we should better think of it as some kind of persuasion or dialogue in which two people a brand and a consumer construct the meaning or the value of a brand between them. So these are two very different models, two very different ideas about how branding and marketing communications works. The monologue view says marketers' brands create the value and then they transmit it to the consumer. The dialogue persuasion view says no, the consumer does something as well. And last week we looked at different rhetorical styles which brands and marketing communicators employ to try to persuade people, but we didn't talk about how those different rhetorical styles actually work. We just said you need to generate ethos, you need to generate logos, you need to generate pathos, you can use schema, you can use tropes. These were all the concepts we talked about last week. People that weren't there. But we didn't say how they worked. We just sort of said something must happen inside the consumer's mind for them to be persuaded, for them to accept the information in this transmitted. This week, we're going to start looking inside the consumer's mind and cover some different theories and explanations for what might happen inside a consumer's mind when they're exposed to branding and marketing communications. So we're going to look at 3. And what I really want to encourage you to do here is to realise that there is no one correct answer to that question of what happens inside a consumer's mind. There are different schools of thought. And my personal belief, and this is backed up by research with practitioners, is that most practitioners don't think one theory is right and all the rest are wrong. They think one theory is appropriate for some brands or some marketing campaigns, and a different approach is appropriate for another. So we're going to look at three, and the temptation often when we look at different schools of thought is for people to say, this one's right, this one's wrong. I would encourage you not to think about all the bad things about them, but think about what's the use for each of them. They each tell us something different about how marketing, communications, and branding works. So first we're going to look at behaviourism. It's a very simple psychological model. You've probably covered some of this previously on consumer behaviour courses, maybe even sort of general management courses if you've done business more generally. Then we're going to look at cognitive psychology. And this is probably the prominent approach that you'll see in academic research. And then finally we look at depth psychology, which, while not particularly popular in academic research, is much more influential amongst practitioners. So behaviourism, cognitive psychology, and depth psychology. That's what we'll do today. My plan was to go through all the lecture, and then there's a task for you to do, which I know you're going to love. So what I was thinking of doing is I'll just go through the lecture, and then you can have some time to do the task, go and get a coffee if you need to, and hopefully we'll finish earlier than we did last week. Does that sound okay? Yeah, we'll go with the silence means yes. Great. Okay. So why psychology? Why is psychology important? Well, we obviously now know it's important because maybe it tells us something which our discussion last week didn't tell us. But why else is psychology important? Well, this is a phrase which practitioners, you see in the practitioner literature a lot. A product is made in a factory, a brand is made in a consumer's mind. And psychology is the study of the mind, what happens inside the mind. So if we want to say that a brand is made in a consumer's mind, surely we need to have some kind of account of what happens inside that mind. Psychology is one of the preeminent disciplines which is used in branding and marketing communications research for this very reason. So a few years ago, there was a content analysis of academic papers looking at branding and advertising. And by far, the dominant academic discipline which is used in academic research is psychological theory. So, dual processing models, which we're going to talk about later on today, is psychological theory. Involvement, which we're going to talk about later today, is a psychological theory. Information processing models is a psychological theory. Source credibility is a psychological theory. So 4 of the top 5 concepts discussed over the last, sort of 30 years, branding and marketing communications comes from psychology. Chances are, if you read a paper or an article in branding and marketing communications, it's going to be using psychological theory. Okay, so it's really, really popular. It's really, really influential in terms of academic theories, and all of that ties back to the fact brands want to know how is it that their brand is made in the consumer's mind. And each of these, dual processing models, is an explanation of that. Okay. So why are we starting with psychology? We're starting with psychology because it's really important. Okay. So, unfortunately, while psychology is really important, it's also quite difficult to get your head around because obviously we're not psychologists. There are people doing master's degrees in psychology departments that spend all their time, do whole courses on involvement and processing models. We only get one lecture, so we're going to have to move through things quite quickly. The other problem with psychology is it tends to get quite technical quite quickly, and as a result it can be kind of boring quite quickly. So I apologise if some of today's lecture is boring. I'll try to make it interesting by telling jokes and things. But unfortunately, there's just a technical language that you have to kind of understand. So involvement in psychology has a very specific meaning, which is different from just kind of everyday meaning when you might talk about involvement in different ways. Remember last week we talked about the idea of polysemy, a word being polysemic, having many different meanings. Lots of these words, like source, credibility, involvement, you might think you know what they are, but they've got technical meanings. So I want to go through those technical meanings today.
But I apologise now because it is a little bit boring. Okay? Let's start doing it rather than saying how boring it is. Let's see if it's boring. You can tell me. Okay, so let's start with behaviourism. Behaviourism is a really, really easy psychological theory to understand, I think. And it's an easy theory to understand because it actually doesn't really try to explain what happens in the mind at all. So for behaviourists, the idea is it's actually philosophically impossible to know what happens inside someone's mind. So their argument is, because we can't definitely know what's going on in somebody's mind, let's not bother. Let's concentrate on the things we can definitely, objectively agree on. So they focus on what they call a stimulus. What is somebody exposed to? Did you guys see an advert? Did you guys not see an advert? That is a stimulus. You had a stimulus and you haven't had it. Okay? Then behaviourists say something happens inside people's minds, you don't know what. Maybe you all think it's really funny, maybe you don't, but how do you know that you think it's as funny as you? It's impossible to tell, according to behaviourists. So instead, they look to see what happens afterwards. Okay? So all of you people who have been exposed to an advert go on and buy the brand. And all of you people that haven't, not buy it. The behaviourist account is, well, if that happens, it's a good advert, it works. If all of you people love this brand that's been advertised to you, and all of you people don't, and you saw an advert and you didn't, behaviourists say, we don't know why. So it's sometimes called the black box model, because they say the human mind is a black box. You don't know what's inside, you can't see what's inside it. So don't bother looking. What we can do is measure stimuli or inputs to that black box and responses or outputs to the black box. And then using many of the standard research methodologies, quantitative usually, research methodologies, you can correlate and regress and analyse the relationship between the stimulus and the response. So if you find, for example, that if people are exposed to an advert which is funny and are more likely to respond by buying the product, the behaviourists say, well, the advert worked. Why? They don't know. They don't go into the black box. Does that make sense? So it's a kind of simple model to get your head around, and it lies in the background of a lot of marketing management techniques, particularly data-driven techniques and digital techniques, where you can measure what was somebody exposed to. It's like on online advertising or social media, you can track. Has somebody seen an advert? Did they click on it? Did the people who saw the advert click on it more than people that didn't see the advert? Or did they buy the product more, I should say? Sometimes they always clicked. They didn't see it. So that's the behaviourist model. Sometimes you'll see it called an SR model. When you say SR model, it's a behaviourist model. The S means stimulus. So what do you think the R means? Response. Exactly, yeah. Sometimes it's called a black box model. And why is that? Because there's a black box in the middle of it. Okay. But really simply, all you have to do is measure the stimulus, measure the responses. Now, for academic researchers, this creates something of a problem, because the question is which responses count. If you're a brand, or maybe like a big supermarket, you know whether you've released an advert, and you've got the sales data. But academics typically don't have access to that type of data. So it can actually be really difficult for academics in brand marketing communication to use behaviourism, because they don't have the data. So instead, what they start to argue for is different types of responses. So one argument would be, brands aren't all about sales. There's a difference between creating a valuable brand and selling a product. So the response you're looking for might not be sales, might be increased brand value. So you start then to have to go into that black box, start to ask people how much do you like the brand, not just record simple responses. And this is where mainstream psychological behavioural theory is different from branding and marketing communications behavioural theory. So technical, strict psychological theory, they do studies not on consumers, but they'll do anything like animals, for example, and they'll see if you give an animal a treat, will it do something you want it to do? So you might have seen videos where they train pigeons to play ping pong or dogs to play chess. And they do that by giving them particular types of stimuli to encourage different types of responses. And there's an element of training in standard behavioural theory, which isn't the case in marketing communications. Marketing communications is simply the idea you don't have a theory of what happens inside the mind. We just quantitatively measure stimulus and response. So as a brand, you choose your response, it might be sales, it might be increased brand value, whatever. And then you correlate, you measure how many people see adverts, how many of them end up doing the response that you want. An example of this, which actually combines practical branding applications with branding and marketing communications research, is the ATR model. Has anybody heard of the ATR model before? It's okay if you haven't, I don't mind. So, awareness, did someone say awareness? Someone's heard of it before. Brilliant. Well, awareness is what that A stands for. T stands for trial, and R stands for reinforcement. ATR model. The story behind the ATR model is a group of researchers, mainly led by a man called Andrew Ehrenberg. Is everyone all right? Why is everyone talking? Okay. Yeah, a group of researchers were given sales data. Oh, you can't read that, can you? Ehrenberg. Okay. A group of researchers were given sales data by a big supermarket. So what they had was a big record of responses. And then they went back and looked through magazines, television programs that spoke to advertising agencies. And they tried to see what kind of advertising campaigns were launched around the time that the sales data came. So they could correlate the stimuli for advertising campaigns with responses. And they found something really shocking for branding and marketing communications theory. What they found was, although there was lots of different advertising campaigns for lots of different brands, most consumers didn't change their behaviour at all. So it was supermarket data, and what they found was most people, when they go to the supermarket, they buy the same toothpaste. They buy the same rice. They buy the same bread. They buy the same vegetables. They don't switch brands all the time. They found that people were actually really, really likely to be loyal. And they developed the idea of habit. So sometimes in your consumer behaviour course, you probably talked about habit or habitual consumption. The idea that the best predictor of what people are going to do is what they've done in the past. So actually, the advertising and branding doesn't really do anything. So well, why do brands advertise then? They've got the sales data, they know what's happening. Why do they waste their money advertising if it doesn't persuade people to change their behaviour? And this is where they develop the ATR model. The first letter, A, awareness. They said, okay, maybe people aren't persuaded to try a new brand, but sometimes people do change their behaviour. Maybe you go to the supermarket and your favourite brand of toothpaste isn't on the shelf. Or they moved it and you don't know where it is. Or you're in a rush and you just need to grab something. What happens then? Then they argue advertising has a function. Because if you're not aware of a brand, if you don't know that it is a type of toothpaste, you're never going to consider it. So they said, don't think about the stimuli being exposed to advertising causing the change in behaviour. That doesn't happen. People change their behaviour just randomly. But they're not going to pick your brand if they're not aware of it. So the first function of advertising on their model, their behaviourist model, is just to make people know your brand exists. So that when they choose, for whatever reason, to change their behaviour, they might consider your brand. That's awareness. Trial. They said, well, okay, advertising doesn't seem to persuade people in the way some of the other psychological theories we're going to be talking about in this lecture do. But if you say to somebody, iPhones are free, that will change some people's behaviour. So it said, advertising can stimulate people to try a new product, to try a different product, by promoting offers, discounts, sales, and so on and so forth. So it can encourage somebody to try a new product. And it does it primarily by promoting some kind of discount, which gets people's attention and changes what they think is interesting. So, you might be aware of the fact that an iPhone exists, but not consider it. But yeah, if it was 75% off, it stimulates a trial. Okay? So advertising can make people aware, and it can stimulate trials. And the final function of advertising on this module, reinforcement, tells us that one of the main reasons brands have to advertise is everyone else advertises. So they said, well, maybe one of the reasons people don't change their behaviour that much is because they see lots of adverts for the brands that they're already buying, which confirm to them that they've made a good choice. So the idea, they said, is maybe a lot of advertising isn't to get new customers, maybe it's to keep your existing customers. Right, so let's just imagine you go and buy your new iPhone for £1,000, and then you never see an advert for the iPhone ever. And all you see are Samsung adverts telling you how great the Samsung is. According to the ATR model, all of a sudden your iPhone is going to start to look a bit rubbish because you're receiving all these messages telling you that a Samsung is a better phone. So the reinforcement element says you've got to stop that, particularly for product categories where people buy them very regularly. Like, say, toothpaste. You buy that every month, so you can quickly change your brand. So you need to reinforce people's existing behaviours. Stop your competitors being able to stimulate trials. Stop your competitors raising awareness amongst your customers. Okay? That's the idea. The idea is, if you've got really strong advertising, if your brand's not available, your customers won't switch, they'll wait. Which is the difference between being habitual and loyal. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, we'll go into silence and yes again. So the final thing that APR model really usefully explains. Ehrenberg and his colleagues found out that in most sectors, the market-leading brand advertises the most. Now, if advertising was just about getting new customers, that wouldn't make sense, because the market-leading brand already has the most customers. So why would they advertise more than their competitors? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense at all, right? You would think if you already had the most customers, you wouldn't need to advertise because you wouldn't have many more to win. The ATR model says the opposite, right? Why does the leading brand advertise the most? To reinforce all those existing customers and stop them switching. Okay. So, why is the ATR model a behavioural model? Because they looked at sales data responses, they looked at stimuli or inputs, and that's what they based their findings on. That's what they based their analysis on. They didn't go and interview consumers or do surveys or experiments with consumers. They just looked at their behaviours. And they said if you just look at their behaviours, you start to find out some really interesting things. You don't need to go inside this black box. Okay? Has anybody got any questions about behaviourism? No? Good. I told you it was simple, but boring. As I was saying before, one of the problems with the behavioural approach and why it's very influential, but also people don't talk about it too much, is it focuses on measurable behaviours. So in the Everyday example, they had sales data. They knew what people had bought. That's kind of difficult to argue with, because if you buy a product, you've bought the product. Right? We can't argue about that particularly philosophically or anything. We just know you've bought the product. But a lot of branding theory says the purpose of branding isn't just to get people to buy products. It's to get people to pay more for the products. It's to get people to have relationships with the products. It's to get people to feel emotional attachments with the products. Those things aren't easily measurable. And there's just a practical problem of it's not easy for everybody to get sales data. Brands don't often like to give people sales data because people know what they're doing, right? Your competitors would know. So out of this, we then developed this idea of intermediate effects. Rather than measuring sales, brand theorists said, well, maybe something happens before you get to a sale. Maybe something else happens because we can measure more easily as academic researchers. And they developed what they call SOR models. SOR models. Stimulus, organism, which means the human, the black box, response. So some people started to go and measure physiological responses. So things like neuromarketing that you might have heard of, where people put things on people's brains, or they measure people's heart rate, so they look at their pupils and see what they're doing. That is an SOR. Right? It's not looking at sales, it's looking at an effect before somebody buys a product. So there's various theories which would say, for example, you can map people's brains and see whether they are engaging with or liking your advert. Looking inside the human, the organism, going inside the black box. Okay? So there's one group of researchers that have used this to look at physiological measures, so physical measures of the person's body. And then there are others who have gone inside the consumer's mind to look at intermediate effects in the mind. And this is where we get to cognitive psychology. So cognitive psychology, cognition means thinking, essentially. So when you hear cognitive psychology or cognition, it just means thinking. So cognitive psychology intentionally wants to explore what's the process of thinking. When somebody's being stimulated by an advert or a brand, what do they think about it? How do they think about it? And then, if possible, what's the relationship between those thoughts and responses? Whether that's sales, brand value, brand equity, whatever it might be. Okay, so cognitive psychologists try to do. They try to go inside the black box and figure out what happens inside somebody's mind. So the first one we can look at is a pretty simple model that focuses on tracking or understanding how is it that the consumer gets the information from an advert or a brand. So if an advert says iPhones are free, how does that message get into the consumer's head so that they know iPhones are on sale this week or this brand of toothpaste is available? How do they learn that information? This is very much a transmission model or a monologue model, which tries to track how the consumer gets the information from an advert or a brand. And it's based on a model of consumer behaviour that you should be familiar with, I hope. sometimes called the problem solving, sometimes even called the information processing model of consumer behaviour. I'll just quickly run through it for those of you that maybe have forgotten or haven't covered it. The problem solving model of consumer behaviour says people consume things when they have some kind of a want or a need. So I need a coffee because I've just got up and I've got to go and teach. I want to get some new clothes so that I look good. Okay? The problem solving model says when that happens, the consumer has a problem. They want or need something, so they're going to try and figure out how to solve that want or to ameliorate, if that's the right word, that need, to satisfy that need. And to do that, the first thing they'll do is they'll do what's called information search. They'll think, okay, what do I know that can solve my need for coffee? Well, I want a cup of coffee, so I need to go to a coffee shop. If I need some new clothes, I'll search my brain and think, okay, well, where can I go and get new clothes? What kinds of clothes can I get? Which shops have I used before? Which brands did I like? Which fit me? Which do I think look good? Okay, I'll go there. If the consumer doesn't know enough inside their brain, then they'll do what's called an external search. So you might go online if you're in a new city. If you want a coffee, you don't know where the coffee shops are. You might go on TripAdvisor or some, Google or some other social media and try to find a good coffee shop. You're still looking for information. That's an information search, but you're not looking. Sorry, in your mind, you're looking outside. Once you've got that information, you evaluate it. You pick the product, brand or service or retailer which seems best to satisfy your need or want. You acquire it, you buy it, you get it, you steal it, you borrow it, etc. And then afterwards, you evaluate the whole thing. Right, so you should all be familiar with this model, right? You've covered this before? Yeah, okay, well, I won't keep going on about it. So if you're not sure about it, it's pretty simple. But it focuses our attention on information. Right? According to this model, branding and advertising, two functions. One is it can help with problem recognition. It can make people want something they didn't want before. But the main function of branding and advertising, according to this model, is to get information into the consumer's head. Think back to the ATR model. What does the A stand for? Awareness, right? The consumer has to know about your brand if they're going to consider it. This model, the consumer has to know about your brand to consider it. And if it's already in their head, they're more likely to consider it. One of the key findings of the problem-solving model is that people first search their head, and only if they don't feel they've got enough information do they then go and look outside. So they always do an internal search first, then an external search. So if you can get information about your brand or your product in the consumer's head, you can beat the competitors. This is the kind of output of problem-solving models. This is a decision tree for one consumer. So in the 1970s, a researcher called James Bettman followed around, I think it's actually his family members, but that's not been explicitly stated, in the supermarket, and he tried to follow, when they go into the supermarket, how do they decide what to buy? What questions do they ask themselves which lead them to pick up a particular brand of milk or coffee or whatever it might be? This kind of modeling approach is at the heart of cognitive psychology. What cognitive psychologists really like to do is to create a structure or a model of how people think. Now, any of you that have done like operations management or computer programming, things look like this a lot. This is what cognitive psychologists really like to look for. You can almost think of this if you go back to last week in the transmission model that we looked at. So you had, your source, the signal, the media channel, the receiver. So this is explaining what happens at the end of that process. When somebody's received a message, what happens inside their brain? Where does it go for it to get inside their memory? So this is a model of a consumer decision. These are models of what happens when somebody's exposed to marketing communications. This is a simplified model developed by Engel et al. In the 1960s. This is drawn from their 1960 textbook. So let's just talk through it. I think you've got to come around this model. A lot of cognitive psychology is easy to grasp. So this is to start off with, the consumer is exposed to or stimulated with a stimuli, which is an advert or a piece of branding. When that happens, once you've been exposed to it, you might pay attention to it. Not everybody who is exposed to a message pays attention to it. So the first thing cognitive psychologists try to understand is why is it that some people are exposed to a message but don't pay attention to it. And you'll see a lot of research focusing on exposure and attention. How do you get people to pay attention to a message? Once somebody's paid attention to the message, the next step is for them to comprehend it. So they have to start decoding, as we talked about last week, decoding the signal and think, what's this actually saying to me? Is it saying iPhones are for free? Okay, I understand that message. Then I can move on to the next stage of the model. The next stage of the model is called yielding or acceptance. And what this means is, just because somebody can understand the message doesn't mean they believe the message. So if I said to you, iPhones are for free, you might say, I don't believe you, because I know they're really expensive. Why would you be giving them away for free? So you've been exposed, you've given attention, you've comprehended the message, but you don't accept it, because it seems too good to be true. Why don't you accept it? Well, it might go against things you already know. You already know an iPhone's meant to be £1,000, so you're not going to believe, you're not going to accept that somebody's giving it away for free. Once you've accepted it, then you get to what we call retention. You store it in your memory. The memory box at the side here tells us every step in this process, things that people already know influence what's going to happen. So you already know that an iPhone is £1,000, it affects your acceptance of it. If you already know your favourite brand, you don't need to restore the information, it's just reinforcing what you already know. You're not adding an extra message of the same as the other. You use your existing understanding of the world to comprehend things. So, if you see a thing like that, that's Apple. I don't have to tell you, because you already know it. So you see a lot of marketing research focusing on how do we speak the right language so that consumers can comprehend our message? How do we get their attention? How do we communicate or transmit the message in codes that they can easily decode, to use the terms we talked about last week, right? That's the simple model. It's called technically a Markov chain because it says each stage relies on the stage before it. So you need to get a lot of exposure to get a little bit more attention, to get a little bit of comprehension, to get a little bit of acceptance, to get a little bit of retention. Okay? So why do brands advertise a lot? Because they know you get a little bit of attention, you have to get lots and lots of exposure. Stats tell us it's something like we're exposed to up to 5,000 branded messages every day. We don't pay attention to most of them. But when they're pointed out to us and we start to pay attention to them, then we can comprehend so on and so forth. Does anybody have questions about this model? I think it's pretty straightforward. Okay. But you see, like what I said earlier on, exposure, attention, these all have technical meanings. And actually, if you look in the literature, there's technical ways of measuring them It's not just like your everyday understanding of what they mean.
On the right, this is a more complicated explanation
Of information processing. This is from James Beckman's work. I won't go through this in detail because we haven't got time, and I think we'll all fall asleep. But I want to show you how it becomes more and more complicated. And the more that researchers look into each of these processes, the more they see there's other sub-processes inside them. And this is why research has continued, even though we've got this basic model. So they figured out that, for example, some people have a need to acquire new information. Some people are just really likely to pay attention to stuff. There are other people that, for whatever reason, don't have the processing capacity, and they will just zone out all the other things that are happening around them and focus on one thing at a time. Call this processing. There's all these different explanations of the process, which you could look into at your leisure. One of the things that researchers here have found is that the more involved somebody is in a message, the more the message speaks to them personally, not just in sort of cold analytical terms like I know that that means an apple, but the more I'm involved with Apple, the more of an attachment that I have, the more likely it is that I'm going to start processing the message. But ironically, researchers have also found that in between exposure and attention, it turns out a lot of people that are exposed to messages but don't pay attention to them can also end up retaining the information. So this is called a low involvement engagement. So here the idea is you see all these adverts all around you all the time, and your brain just doesn't have the processing capacity to think about them explicitly, but something's going on in the background. Okay? So some examples of that. If I said to you, what did you have for breakfast? You can probably think about what you had for breakfast, but you weren't thinking about it until I asked you the question. Like your brain knows something, it's there, and it only gets brought to mind at a certain point. So you're not involved with the information, we're not always actively processing everything and thinking about it like you're listening to a lecture, but things can start to seep in almost subconsciously or unconsciously. Is the idea behind low involvement processing. And any of you that look in the reading list for information processing, you'll see these models. There's a lot of papers that explain all of these models and really try to dig into lots and lots of these different concepts to understand how they work, to measure their effectiveness. Oops. Okay, so, but behind all of them is a focus on memory, on understanding how to get information into a consumer's mind. This guy, I think we talked about last week, called Ross Reeves, very famous advertising agent. He said, it's as though the consumer carries a small box in his head for any given product. And the aim of branding and marketing communications is to get your brand into that box. Later on, this is talked about in terms of product differentiation and laddering. And there's an idea that everybody has like a little shelf in their brain for any given type of product. And they'll have their number 1 brand, their number 2 brand, their number 3 brand, and then they won't care about anybody else. The aim of marketing communications is to get your brand name onto that shelf. So if I said, like, get a fizzy soda drink, most people would say Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and then another one that you might like. Right? But after that, you start to struggle with things. All of this information processing research focuses on getting information into the consumer's memory. That's the response that they're looking for. But there is a little bit of a problem with this. It's quite an influential theory, the theory being very much driven by economics, that people's knowledge or information drives their behavior. It's a good theory. Okay? Now, if this theory was true, what would you expect to see in branding and marketing communications? Right, you'd expect to see information about products and brands. And intuitively, naively, you probably say, well, yeah, of course that's what brands do, right? They tell their consumers information about their products and brands. Right? We would all agree with that. Unfortunately, when researchers go and look at advertising campaigns, branding initiatives, they find that the level of information is minimal. Very few advertising campaigns actually have much information about products and brands. They'll have some, of course they'll have some, but very, very minimal. Right, so you watched the Super Bowl adverts over the weekend. I don't know if you did, but Super Bowl adverts over the weekend, the most expensive adverts every year. There's almost no product information or brand information. Sometimes there is, but it's very, very small. So the problem with thinking about information processing is it makes a lot of sense in theory, but if you then go and look at what practitioners do, what brands actually invest their money in, they don't focus on delivering information to consumers. So that's a bit weird, isn't it? Cognitive psychologists are not put off by this, and they've developed different models which follow the same style of analysis, focusing not just on getting information from a brand or an advert into a consumer's head, but trying to account for other, more subjective, emotional attachments that people might have to marketing communications. The central idea here of these models is it's not the information that's important, it's what people think about the information that's important. So if I said to you, iPhones are free, you might think, I don't believe that, but I'd really like an iPhone, so I'll go and see if it's free, right? There, you're not just driven by the information, you're driven by your feelings about the information. The fact that you want it to be true. You know it's not true, but you want it to be true. You go back to rhetoric, we've got logos, the information, pathos, your emotions about the information. So the focus of this second set of cognitive psychology is on what they call generally attitudes. So now it's not understanding how consumers extract information from an advert, almost like a computer would extract information. It's how is it that their feelings, their emotions, their attitudes influence that process. How can we model that or give some kind of structure to it? There's a slightly different theory of consumption behind this. I won't go into too much detail about it, but I'll just quickly run through it. Have you looked at the theory of planned behaviour before? Okay, so I'll just quickly go through it for those of you that might have forgotten. So the theory of planned behaviour says we all want to know why people do stuff. The best indicator of why people want to do stuff is their intentions, what they think they're going to do. So if you're doing an SOR analysis, you don't just have to measure their behaviour, you measure their intentions. So you'll probably cover this when you work on this course, and you'll probably cover it on your marketing research course. One of the key measures of marketing is purchase intention. Purchase intention, sometimes called PI. Okay? If you don't know what people are going to buy, you can ask them, how likely would you be to buy something? Purchase intention, okay? The theory of planned behaviour says 3 things drive people's attention. Firstly, their personal attitude to the behaviour or brand or whatever it might be. Do they like it? Do they want to do it? Do they think it would be a good thing for them to do? That's their attitude. Next, their subjective norms. This is their personal beliefs about what they should do. So sometimes there are things that we all want to do, but we think we shouldn't do them. And alternatively, there are things that we don't want to do, but we think we should do them. What we want is our attitude, what we think we should do is our subjective norm. And then finally, our beliefs about how able we are to do something. So the example I like to give is, most of us would probably agree it's a good thing to exercise regularly, to go to the gym. Right? So our attitude is, it's a good thing for us to go to the gym, we want to do it. We probably also think, subjectively, people expect us to be healthy. Society would think it's a good idea if we go to the gym. If you said to your friend, I'm just going to the gym, people wouldn't say, that's a terrible idea, don't go. Most people would think it's a good idea. So why don't lots of us go to the gym? Why don't I go to the gym? Perceived behavioural control. I don't think I've got time. Can't afford the gym membership. The gym's not for people like me to go to. We come up with all these excuses to stop us doing something. The theory of planned behaviour, the key thing of what we're talking about is, this isn't about the information that consumers have extracted from advertising messages, it's about their feelings. So how can brands and marketing communications affect and change people's feelings, their attitudes, their beliefs? The most prominent model here is called the elaboration likelihood model. This is the dominant model in branding and marketing communications theory. Like if we go back to the start of the class. The top 5 theory, number 1, dual processing models, primarily the elaboration likelihood model. So let's just talk through this in a little bit of detail. Oops. Okay, so the first things to point out, just sort of structurally, it's got a similar look to those information processing models, right? It's like a decision tree. That's what cognitive psychologists tend to try to look for, no matter what they're looking at. Right? They want to see what structures are there to the brain when people think. So what does this tell us? Well, it says, first there's some kind of stimuli persuasive communication. You're exposed to some kind of message. Inside your brain, unconsciously almost, you will ask yourself a question when you're exposed to a message. Are you motivated, you're interested in pursuing it further and thinking about it? Okay, so if you are motivated, think about it, for whatever reason, you'll then ask yourself the next question. If the answer is, no, I'm not particularly motivated, you won't pay much attention to it, right? The next question is, can you process the information? Can you engage with it? Do you have the processing capacity? Do you understand the language? Do you have the time to look at it? If the answer to those questions is yes, then you go to the next stage in the process. If the answer to those questions is no, then again you don't pay much attention to it. Once you've said, yeah, I'm motivated and I'm able to process it, you start to engage with it cognitively. And the first set of questions is, well, what do you sort of think about it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Emotionally, affectively. So here it's not, what does the information say? It's what does it make you feel? Do you have unfavourable thoughts, favourable thoughts, or do you just not really care? If you don't really care, the attention that you give it, goes down. So you move out. If you have favourable or unfavourable thoughts, you like it or you don't like it, you move to the next stage. And here is where you consider, are you going to change what you already knew, what you already think, or are you going to keep what you already think the same? Are you going to retain some information from it, or are you going to ignore it? And that depends on what you already felt. So if it's about a brand you already know, you already like that brand, and you like the advert, it's not going to change your brain, it's just going to confirm it, it's going to reinforce it. If you didn't like the advert, but it was a brand that you did like, maybe it changed your attitude towards the brand. It might not, but it might do. Okay. So that process that we talked through, this side here is called the central route. Central route. And it's kind of similar to the information processing model. It just focuses more on how people feel about information. This side of the model is one of the things that's really usefully added. It's called the peripheral route. Peripheral route. The peripheral route. And the peripheral route says, you can't really read the pen. The word is here. Peripheral. The peripheral route, right? The peripheral route says, okay, maybe you're not motivated to process it. Maybe you can't process it because you don't speak the language. Does that mean the advert will have no effect on you? Well, it might do. It might still have some little effect. You might not be giving it your full attention, but it might be on the periphery, so on the edge of your attention. Maybe you didn't really like it one way or the other, so you're not going to continue to elaborate, to think about it, but that doesn't mean it'll have no effect. It could have some effect. So this starts to combine high involvement and low involvement processing. So these are sometimes called dual processing theories, because they tell us why is it that people sometimes really think about an advert or a brand, and why is it sometimes they don't think about it very much? What's the effect of both of them? So let's talk through the peripheral route. Let's say you've been exposed to an advert, and it looks kind of boring, you're not motivated to process it, and you don't speak the language. Right, you've just got into a new country, you don't speak the language, you can see it's like a colourful advert, it's got your attention, but you're not able to process it. Well, according to this model, what happens is you don't just reject it completely. Your brain, in a low involvement, sort of subconscious way, will start to extract some information from it. And that information is called peripheral cues. So you might just get a colour. Right? Or you might just see, okay, I know that's David Beckham, but I don't know what the advert's saying, so I'm not going to carry on thinking about it. So you take some sort of high-level information, broad information about the advert from it. Okay? So what? You've seen an advert and it's blue and you've not thought about it anymore. Who cares? Well, the thing that the model says is, over time, all of those little peripheral bits of information can start to shift your attitude to the whole thing. So as you're exposed to an advert again and again and again, you start to see more and more little bits of information from it, even though you're not motivated to think about it and engage with it much. First off, you just noticed it was blue, then you notice it's got David Beckham on it, then you notice it's for a particular product, and you start to think about it more and more each time you see it. To the point, potentially, not always, but sometimes, where you end up being motivated and able to understand it. And this is called a peripheral attitude shift. So again, why do advertisers and brands advertise so much, even though they know people don't pay attention to lots of the adverts that they see? Because enough of them can shift more and more people's attitudes so they're willing to do it. Does that make sense? Okay, if it doesn't make sense, maybe send me an email. Now, one of the things that's just confusing about the elaboration likelihood model is the name. So, when you see the word elaboration, it just means thinking. How elaborately are people thinking about something? So the central route is high elaboration. People are thinking about it a lot. The peripheral route is low elaboration. Because people aren't really thinking about it. They're not elaborating on the information in the advert. So that's why it's called the elaboration model, because it models how elaborately you think. Because we can have high elaboration and low elaboration. Why has it got likelihood in it?
Because each of these questions tells you how likely somebody is to elaborate on the advert. If you're motivated and able, it's highly likely that you will highly elaborate or think about the advert. If you're not motivated, it's not likely at all that you're going to highly elaborate on the advert. Make sense? Good. So, this style of modelling is, as I said, really, really popular in branding and marketing communications. I won't talk through all of this, but I just wanted to show you this is the type of model which academic branding and marketing communicators develop as a result of these ideas. Oops. Where'd it go? There it is, right? So here people are trying to understand what are the components of people's attitudes which are necessary for them to either go through the central route or the peripheral route. So this is somebody's attitude towards an ad. And they say it's influenced by things like their attitude towards the advertiser. So if it's an Apple ad, if you like Apple, chances are you might like the advert. There's a relationship there. They start to model all different elements of the advert. And this is where we get questions of things like source credibility. How much do people believe the source or the sender of an advert? And research uses the elaboration likelihood model, dual processing model, to look at the effects of all different types of attitudes. Attitudes towards an ad, an advertiser, a brand, different elements within an ad, different styles of execution, different types of rhetoric. And this is the kind of, like I say, this is the kind of thing they produce. So they produce a model, then you develop some measurements for each of these things, and then you use standard quantitative methods that you can actually look at on this course in a couple of weeks to figure out, is there a reliable pattern? Here's another one. So, one of the things that this shifts our attention to is we're no longer just thinking in terms of memory and information. Now we start to be thinking about people's emotions, people's feelings about an advert. People's emotions and feelings with all the components in an advert. So let's look at this one. I think it's a really cool example. Has everybody seen the Hello, I'm a PC, I'm a Mac advertising? Get that? So what information is there in this advert? What does this tell you about PCs and Macs? Right? The answer is nothing. There's very little information, like product information. It doesn't say, you know, a Mac has a 28-inch screen and a 2 point whatever gigahertz processor and costs blah, blah, blah. There's no product information. But this campaign played off people's emotions and their attachments with characters. So in every different Apple market, they had different people playing Mac and PC. So these are two famous comedians in the UK. This is the UK advert. And Mac was the kind of cool, hipstery character, and PC was the sort of nerd character that was always going wrong and breaking stuff. So this wasn't about this execution wasn't about the information. It was using people's emotions and attachment to these characters to give some kind of message to consumers. To help them construct the idea that Macs are kind of cool and they work really well and PCs are always breaking and that they're not very good. Apple actually ended up cancelling this campaign. The reason they cancelled it was because it was too successful in the wrong way. What actually happened was people really liked the PC character. And so when they were measuring how much did people like the characters, they found they were actually advertising for PCs more than Macs. And people started to find the Mac character unlikable. So they didn't like the character. Not the product, not information about the product, they didn't like the character. So, cognitive psychology moves from focusing on information, and the problem with focusing on information is lots of adverts don't have information in them. Starts focusing on attitudes and thinks about the range of different attitudes that consumers have, which influence whether they're going to engage with a brand. And this has led to so much research, it's untrue, looking at all different elements of branding and marketing communications. The attitudes consumers have to different types of music, the attitudes consumers have to different types of colours, the attitudes consumers have to different types of models. Do consumers prefer to have an unknown model or a really famous model? Are there particular celebrities that consumers like and other celebrities they don't like? All of these things are measured, all of these things are researched to try to figure out how best to get consumers to elaborate on the central routes. Okay. Make sense? Cool. Okay, so how are we looking at time? Oh, perfect. Okay. So, we've got behavioural psychology, which looks at the relationship between stimulus and responses. We've got cognitive psychology, which tries to go inside the mind of the consumer and figure out what processes go on, either when consumers extract information about a brand from an advertising message, or change their feelings about a brand, their attitudes towards a brand. Okay? Black box models are very useful in kind of market management settings, because they really focus on, can you quantify the relationship between a stimulus and a response? Cognitive psychology is really popular in academic applications. But you go into many advertising agencies and they're not sat around talking about people's attitudes and liking and different measurements and central routes and peripheral routes. There's a final psychological theory that I want to talk about, which is probably more intuitive and slightly easier to understand, I think, and is more popular or prominent amongst practitioners. So this is just an example of it. This is an advertising industry talk I went to a couple of years ago. This guy was the creative director. Can't see him too well. He's the creative director of one of the largest advertising agencies in the UK, and he was talking about how they came up with an advertising campaign that had just won all the awards. It was awarded as being the best advert in the whole world for the previous year. And he started off his talk with this slide, and he said, at the heart of that advert, they were interested in love, sex, and death. Now, of course, the advert didn't just say love, sex, and death, but what they were interested in was all these emotions, not just nice emotions, but all these hidden, unconscious, dark emotions that people might not even want to admit to themselves. Because his argument was, these things are ultimately what drives consumers or motivates consumers to act in certain ways. So why do people go to the gym? According to what we're going to look at, depth psychology, it's not because they're interested in perceived behavioural control or subjective norms. It's because they're scared of death, they want sex, and they need to be loved. That's why, according to depth psychology. So, one of the first things to get your head around in depth psychology is it accepts the idea that there is processing of advertising messages which are completely below the level of your consciousness. Completely below the level of your consciousness. Last week, I talked briefly about a research study by a guy called James Vickery. James Vickery was a very popular and prominent marketing researcher in the 1940s, and then he went missing. He went missing as a result of this study here. He embedded into a movie really short messages which would say, hungry, eat popcorn, thirsty, drink Coke.
And they were flashed up so quickly that your eye could see them, but your brain couldn't process them. Seems a bit weird, but psychologists know your eyes can see things, but your brain doesn't have time to process it. Your body can feel things, but your brain doesn't have time to process it. So, you've probably seen like people walk across hot coals. Have you seen people do this? It's like people put some like boiling coals on the floor and you can walk across them and it shouldn't burn in your feet because the coals are so hot. The reason people can do it is your feet feel the hot heat, but your brain doesn't have time to feel pain. This is called subliminal processing. I'll try not to see it. Subliminal processing. Sub means beneath, and liminal means you're aware of. Rubbish. So subliminal processing. The idea here is you can see an advert, not know you've seen the advert, and it can still change your behaviour. So in the James Vicker example, these messages were flashed up so quickly people could see them, but they didn't know they'd seen them. And then he measured, did people who had watched the movie buy more popcorn than people that hadn't watched the movie? And he reported that people who had seen this movie with these messages embedded in that just flashed up so quickly the brain didn't know it had seen them, bought 60% more popcorn than people that had seen the movie without the messaging. And afterwards, when he said to people, did you see an advert in that movie? They'd all say, no, of course we didn't see an advert in the movie. Their eyes had seen it, their brain hadn't had time to consciously process it. Oops. So, this understanding that your brain is thinking things which you don't know it's thinking is at the heart of depth psychology. Your brain is always thinking things about love, sex, and death which you don't know it's thinking. But at the heart of what you do are those instinctual drives. So it's based on this idea. The idea that you have an unconsciousness, a bit of your brain that really motivates you to do things, is the real reason you do things, but your brain doesn't let you know what's going on. Okay? I'll just quickly talk through this. So, the psychoanalytic model of the mind, the idea that you have a deep mind. You don't have processes, but you have processes at different levels. Some of which you're aware of, like, I really like David Beckham. What's that advert about? And some of which you're not aware of. Why do I really like David Beckham? Is it about love? Is it about sex? Is it about death? What's going on? So, psychoanalytic model of the mind says you've got a bit of you called your ego, which is your sense of who you are, that's aware of what's happening around you, that makes sense of things, that tells yourself stories about why you do things that you're happy about. You've got a bit beneath your ego, in your brain, which you're not aware of. And there's two components. You've got the superego, which is like your mum and dad inside your brain. It's the bit of you which sort of beats you up for not doing your homework, or makes you disappointed if you've been up all night having a party. Right? That's called your superego. And then you have your id, which is like a child in your brain, which is the bit of your brain which says, just do stuff. Just do it, don't worry about it. Go and just buy those things. Have a party, eat more cake, it's fine, just do it. That's the id. It's like a child that just wants to do stuff. The id wants the sex, the love, the death. The superego says, no, don't do those things. That's naughty, you shouldn't do them. And your ego is the bit of you which is aware of what you're doing. I can see I've just eaten that cake. Why did I do that? And the idea in this depth model is people think they do things for a reason, but actually they're unconscious of the real things that are driving them to do things. And if marketers and brands speak to those unconscious drivers, they can change people's behaviour. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How can marketing activities arouse response from this group to unconscious?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, well, how can marketers actually then do something to arouse response? How can they speak to the id and the superego? How can they get your child to go and buy the product and stop your superego from stopping them, right? So let me give you some examples. This is a really famous advertising campaign. We'll talk about this one. So in the 1950s, there was a depth psychologist, a marketer called Ernst Dichter. I'll write it down. See if any of these work. Ernst Dichter. Anyway, he was hired by a car company, not a particularly popular car company. His name's not important, don't worry. The story is important, not his name. So he was hired by a car company that was not a popular car company to come up with a new advertising campaign. And Dichter said, well, if we want to come up with a new advertising campaign, we need to understand, why do people buy cars? Why do people value particular brands of cars over others? And what he did was, he spent months going into car showrooms, and he watched hundreds and hundreds of people in car showrooms. He didn't do what James Bettman did and went and asked them questions about, what are you thinking right now? He just watched them. Because his argument was, if you ask them, their ego will talk back to you. But he didn't want to talk to the ego, he wanted to talk to the id and the superego. So he just watched what people did, things they weren't aware of themselves. And he noticed two very interesting things. The first thing he noticed, it was the 1950s, right? So it tended to be husbands and wives that would go in and buy cars. Just was the case. Up to that point, people thought cars were men's things. And he noticed that when husbands and wives went into car showrooms, it was usually the wife that made the decision. The man might pay for it and put his name on the car certificate, but it was the wife that made the decision. So his first idea was, well, let's start showing wives and advertising women's magazines about cars. Now, if you asked them, who is it that's going to drive the car? They'd say the man. The man always drives the car. But that was their ego talking, because that's what they thought they should say. In reality, the woman made the decisions. But then Dichter saw something else that was really, really interesting from a depth psychology perspective. What he saw was that a couple would walk into a car showroom, and the wife would gravitate towards quite practical cars, like big cars where you can fit shopping in and all that kind of stuff. The men would always, or almost always, walk off, and without thinking about it, they would go to these like really fast sports cars. And he said if you watched them, they would sort of stroke them, and they'd look at them and they'd sort of glaze over when they'd see these sports cars. And they'd never buy the sports car. Because then the wife would come and grab them by the arm and lead them along and look at the more practical car. And when he interviewed them afterwards, he would say, why did you go and look at that sports car? And the men would say, I didn't look at the sports car. We came to buy a practical family car. That's what we needed. We needed a family car. That was their ego talking. So Dichter said, well, why did they deny looking at the sports car? What is it about the sports car that was attractive to them that their ego then denied they were interested in? And his idea was, the sports cars were small. The sports cars didn't have many seats in them. The sports cars didn't have a big boot at the back where you could put shopping and things. Right? The sports cars didn't have space for your family and your children and your wife. The sports car, he said, when the men went over to the sports car, they were dreaming for a few seconds of a life without the family, without their job, without their kids, without their boring lives. Right? So he said, don't think about a car as being a car. Think about a car as being about love, sex, and death. He said, what we can do with our brands is we can make them really valuable to men if we emphasize that our cars are about escaping the real world. Our cars let you pretend you don't have a family, you don't have a wife, you don't have kids, and you can just drive off into the sunset. You can be free. So he said, think of cars as being like a mistress. It's like you're cheating on your wife. That's what men want out of a car, he said. So your question, how do marketers use that? Here's an advert by Jaguar. What's the first thing you notice? Where's the car? Where's the car, right? It's here. What's around the car? Mountains, deserts. How many people have driven a car through mountains and deserts? Like, none of you have, right? This is not a practical thing that you can engage with. Where are the other cars on the road? There are none, right? This is a car on its own, isolated, no one else around. Where's the information about the car so far in this advert? There is none, right? We know it's a sports car, but it could be any sports car. That was it. How many people in the car? One. You watch adverts for sports cars, there's going to be one person in the car, and the car is going to be driving in some beautiful natural surrounding with no one else around. Or, and I couldn't find it, I was hoping it's going to come up, my favourite one, people are driving around this sports car in the middle of nowhere, and then they drive into the city, and they give the keys to another man, and the next man gets in the car, and the advert is he drives it around and escapes life. What information is there about the car? None. But it's speaking to the consumer's ear. Right? This is what drives consumers according to depth psychology. These hidden instincts, and good marketing communicators, good advertising agents, find ways to symbolically communicate those values. Right, so you don't have to say it. You don't say, our car is something that lets you escape your boring life, because that makes people think about having a boring life. That's not what you want to do. You show it with imagery, with symbolism, and in really smart, clever ways. This, do you want to know which advert this guy was talking about when he said it was about love, sex, and death? Shall I show you the advert that he was talking about? I'll show you the advert. It's good. So what was it that drove them to make this advert? Love, sex, and death, right? And what do we see in the advertising campaign? Sorry, yeah. Right, we see a little boy, the child, what's the id? The child, right? Observing almost romantic relationships, love and sex, which he doesn't quite understand, that eventually leads his parents to make him happy by buying his penguin another penguin that he can make kiss the penguin. Right? This is all about love, sex, and death, these things that really motivate people to do things. What they said they were trying to communicate with this message was, John Lewis, which is a big department store in the UK, is the home of thoughtful giving. If you want to give somebody something that really matters to them, something that's really important, you go to John Lewis. That was it, right? So does that help answer your question a little bit about how brands use these ideas? A little bit. Well, look, let me... oh, no. Sorry, guys. So, if you want to see some examples of this, there's a really cool documentary that's available called The Persuaders, where they follow marketing consultants that use depth psychology and advise brands. And they advise all of your favourite brands in this documentary. Brands going to pay hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to go and have an hour, 2 hours with these brand consultants who talk to them about their consumers' unconscious motivations and how they can use their brand to speak to them. The problem, though, with this approach is precisely it's more artistic. It's not as simple as the kinds of research that behavioural psychology and cognitive psychology produces. Cognitive psychology tells you things like, if you use this type of celebrity, people's attitudes will change by this much, and they can put a number on how much. Behavioural psychology says, if you use this type of stimulus, you will get this many responses, and they can put a number on how many. So it tells you really directly how to do things. Depth psychology doesn't. Depth psychology is much more about interpretation and feeling. It's more of an art form. And this, of course, is why practitioners love it, because you have to pay them a lot of money for them to use their expertise and their understanding, rather than just say, do this and you get this result. Okay? That's the problem with it, is it's not as easy to translate into marketing practice. You would think, and yet, ironically, you go to the biggest marketing agencies in the world, and they'll be much more comfortable talking about unconscious motivations, love, sex, and death, than they would about central elaboration and peripheral processing, which is kind of strange, right? It's harder to see the relationship with practice, and yet practitioners prefer it. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to get through today. I've got a task that I'd like us to do in the remaining 20 minutes. Has anybody got any questions before we start the task? No? Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
Just wondering, what's the relationship between the black box model and the ATM model? They're the same thing, or the ATM model is the solution for that?
So, okay, the question was, what's the relationship between the black box model and the ATR model? How do they fit together?
Yeah.
Okay, so the black box model is a general psychological theory that can be used to explain anything that you want to. It can explain why you asked that question. It's not just about branding and marketing communications. The ATR model is a particular behaviourally informed model of branding and marketing communications. So it's based on behavioural ideas, but it applies them specifically to brands and marketing communications. And the reason it does that is methodologically, when they developed the ATR model, they looked at stimuli, they looked at responses, and they didn't care about what happened in the middle. And so if you go and read the ATR model paper, which you're welcome to do, what you won't see are things like this. This is inside the black box. This is inside the black box. So the ATR model doesn't offer an account inside the black box. Does that make sense? Any other questions? No? Okay, great. So here's the task. In groups, you're going to be given a sentence. All you have to do is read your sentence and think about which model, which theory that sentence is best applied to. That's it. And somebody from your group can stand up and say which theory, model, or model sentence is right. Okay guys, you've got 10 minutes to think about that. As you're thinking about it, you might also like to think, what do you think is good about the psychological model that your sentence applies to? What do you think's bad about it? And how does it apply?